In this video, we'll explore the inspiration and parallels that Inazuma has with real-world history, as well as look at limited in-game accounts we have about the region. This will help us theorize on the events and the motivations of those involved. We know Inazuma is governed by the Bakufu, a former military government that was present during feudalism in Japan. Another way to refer to it is the Shogunate, headed by the Shogun, a role that throughout feudalism evolved as it gained power. So to start off, a brief history so we can define our terms and set the stage for the specific period we'll be exploring. The title Saitai Shogun, which means a general that subdues or quells barbarians, was first obtained by Tomo no Otomaro, given to him by Emperor Kamu in 794 CE. During this time, the emperor would have control over what would become the shogunate. The shogun's jurisdiction was limited to military forces. However, as the feudal nature of Japanese society grew, military control became paramount to the control of the country. As a result, the shogun gained more and more influence, causing the emperor to take a more symbolic role of sovereignty. Minamoto Yoritomo established the first shogunate in Kamikura in 1185 CE. On top of their military powers, they gained administrative and judicial ones. The shogun's position was hereditary, meaning it would often be passed down to family or on the rare occasion to close acquaintances. You could say it's comparable to a king, which was common in the West at this time. They appointed military governors to head each province. These were originally known as shugo, which means governor, protector. These governors then would assign stewards to supervise the estates of which these provinces were then divided into, establishing a hierarchical network which proved to be an effective way of governance. The Kamakura shogunate collapsed in 1333. The current emperor Go-Daigo desired a return to a time where his position held a monopoly on power. He attempted to go against the shogunate but ultimately failed. As a result, he was exiled, but with time he managed to sway some of the warlords who were unhappy with the status quo. Amongst them was Ashikaga Takeuji, a commander within the shogunate, who launched an attack on Hyenkyo, while another warlord by the name of Nitai Yoshida attacked Kamakura, with both of them coming out victorious. Ashikaga wished to become the next shogun, but Go-Daigo refused, as his desire was to hold on to his dominance. Unfortunately for him, he was overthrown and exiled for a second time, replacing him with another emperor, and started Ashikaga's reign as shogun for the next 150 years. I share this example to give you a clear idea of how the power of the shogun has grown by this time. The Shugo from the previous era became increasingly independent. By the 16th century they were more commonly known as Daimyo, land-holding warlords. This led into a period known as the Sengoku, where multiple clans fought for control over Japan. The Ashikaga shogunate was later dissolved by Oda Nobunaga at the end of the century. His motives for waging war was for political unification. This was later achieved by his successor through a reformed system, but his reputation was damaged when he led failed attempts to invade Korea. As a result, eventually a feudal system was re-established under the Takigawa shogunate, which brings us to the start of the Edo period. So what does this all have to do with Inazuma? Well, the point we've stopped at is the point I believe is the inspiration for the region, but I also wanted to introduce the power dynamics within this feudal system. The Electro Archon is known as the Raiden Shogun. This could suggest that she has more of a hands-on approach when it comes to the control over her domain, when compared to our previous two Archons, Barbatos and Murax. With that said, I believe most of the control will be carried out by her military and the Daimyo. This will not entirely be a unified system, so in order to maintain control, the shogun must exert restrictions accordingly. From the early 17th century up until the 19th was a period of time where Japan adopted an isolationist foreign policy known as Sakoku, which means closed country. A series of edicts were issued. These edicts often didn't last a long time, but there were many. Another word for edict is a decree. These included: Japanese ships were strictly forbidden to leave and travel to foreign countries. The native population was prohibited from going abroad. Any that attempted to leave would be executed if caught. Those who were returning from overseas after residing in another country would be put to death. A notable one was the restrictions on Catholicism. Some priests were even tortured until they renounced their faith. These restrictions triggered the Shimabara Rebellion during the start of the period, where Christian rebels and masterless samurai known as Ronin fought against the daimyo of the Shimabara domain. This ultimately failed and greatly hurt the Christian movement within Japan. It's also worth noting that this rebellion was the largest conflict during the Edo period, and the time under the Tokugawa shogunate was relatively peaceful with very little conflict in years preceding. Trade also saw significant restrictions, and it was mostly done through a centralized place, the port of Nagasaki. Trade with China and Korea was allowed. There was also trade with a few ethnic groups indigenous to Japan, and there was a series of islands to the southwest. The most notable trade partner, however, were the Dutch, as they were the only Europeans permitted, and their trade was done at Dejima, an artificial island built originally to trade with the Portuguese in the Bay of Nagasaki. Part of the trade agreement required the Dutch to report to the shogunate on world affairs, especially when it came to Europe. They also aided them in keeping up with the times when it came to the technological front, so their isolationist mindset didn't entirely hinder their progress. Before we finish up on history and start to discuss Inazuma, I think understanding the rationale behind Sakoku policies could give us an idea to the Archon's motivations. The shogunate wanted to separate Japan from influence primarily coming from Portugal and Spain. They were not in favour of the colonial and religious aspects of these countries, and they were considered untrustworthy and a threat to the stability of the shogunate. They were not fond that Catholicism was spreading in the southern parts of Japan, so by stopping contact with these countries, the spread could be quelled, but this wasn't the sole reason for their isolationist mindset. The policies also act as a mean to restrict other lords within the country. The Tozuma Daimyos, for example, used trade links to a huge profit during the Sengoku period, bolstering themselves and their military prowess. By limiting their access, the shogunate could ensure dominance, as the daimyos would no longer have access to such revenue streams to bolster themselves. By funneling the majority of their trade through Nagasaki and away from other parts of the country, the bakufu were able to impose taxes to bolster their own treasury. This was important as the lack of wealth had proven to be a limited factor to the governments that had preceded them. We know that Inazuma has become isolationist within the last year of in-game time. A series of edicts or decrees have been issued by the Archon, but the one that specifically is outlined is the Vision Hunt Decree. It declares visions should be in the sole hands of divinity, but the reasons for this aren't exactly clear. Zhongli states that visions are magical foci bestowed upon those who have been acknowledged by the gods, and that the shogun perceives them as divine blessings that should be under the sole dominion of divinity. She is stated as the god of eternity, and that she is trying to eliminate any unstable element that could pose a threat to her eternal realm. This parallels the Tokugawa shogunate, attempting to maintain their foothold on their dominance. It could be that Baal sees vision holders as a threat to her supremacy, and the idea they should be under the sole dominion of divinity could well be a cover-up for her true motivations of eliminating any threat that could topple her established hold on the region. So if Baal parallels Tokugawa, could there be a parallel for vision holders? They could be a representation for the daimyos, but I believe they actually represent Christians and the Catholic priests. Or maybe more specifically, the visions themselves are a representation for Christianity. What is interesting is the symbolism and terms used around Celestia, visions and gnosis all appear to take heavy influence from Christianity. Seizing and controlling visions could be seen as an act against Celestia itself. Her true motivations for such an act could be beyond maintaining control of Inazuma, and I believe it is something we will not be seeing until much later, where we finally discover the truth. But more on the Shogun later. So does Inazuma have daimyos? Well, I believe the Kamisato house is one example of this. In Liyue, you will find a character known as Atsuko. Originally from Inazuma, she escaped aboard a raft. She comments how restrictive her homeland has become and how to simply leave you need to go through a long approval process with the Kanjo Bugyo. In the Edo period there was something known as the Sanbugyo, which means the three administrators. These included the Kanjo Bugyo, who were responsible for finances. Now the role of the Genshin equivalent is not clear besides them having ties to border control. Their duties could extend to finances and maybe even trade. Atsuko describes Inazuma as a very restrictive place, and she escaped because she had desire for freedom. Baido, a man from Liyue Harbour, was the one who rescued her. He enforces the point by saying it's nigh impossible to get into Inazuma and the border is impenetrable, which reflects strict policies similar to Sakoku. Other administrators include the Jisha Bugyo and the Mashi Bugyo. The Jisha Bugyo was associated with management of shrines and temples, Jisha being a compound of Ji representing Buddhist temples and Sha representing Shinto shrines. We know that Ayaka's brother Ayato holds the position of Shabugyo in the Kamisato house, so he appears to be a close equivalent to the Jisha Bugyo. If there is a Ji Bugyo that oversees Buddhist temples, this is still unknown. but it could be that they split the Ji and the Sha into two different houses, or that an equivalent of Buddhist temples will not be present in Inazuma. The Mashi Bugyo is kind of the odd one out of the three. It covers all kinds of roles pertaining to the public. These would include positions such as Chief of Police, judicial positions, firefighting, or tax collection. What makes it unique to the previous two is it was extended to anybody, whereas the other two were limited to daimyos. What this can tell us about Ayato is he could well be a daimyo, a feudal lord that owns land and may have his own small military. It could even give us hints towards the relations with the shogun herself. He could, for example, have close ties to her and be complicit in her plans. Alternatively, he could be against the actions of the shogunate, but have his hands tied as they've stripped him of his opportunity to gain power to oppose it. This concept could lead to some interesting dynamics within Inazuma. If there are more daimyos, which there will be most likely, we could see a range of views on policies of the Bakufu and see an ununified network. I know if I don't cover this, people will scream in the comments about it, so I'm doing it, alright? To those unaware, there are a series of bottled notes you can find throughout Dragonspine. These letters appear to be sent between two old friends. From the text it appears they have met in person in the past, so the receiver may well have travelled to Inazuma prior to becoming sealed off 1 year ago. Its description reads, "A hefty bottle that came drifting from the waves, carrying tokens of an old friendship and hopes of being reunited. These bottles appear to come from Inazuma. This is suggested through the line. We once believed that war was something that only happened in fairy tales and legends, but now each and every one of us trembles under Her Excellency's thundering wrath. The beach that we used to go to has been sealed, but I found a way to get this letter out nonetheless." Thundering wrath being a huge hint towards Her Excellency being Baal. The bottles themselves don't really give us much information besides confirming increasing restrictions and tension in Inazuma. It also suggests there is some sort of conflict within, but we'll go into what that could be later. First I want to speculate on who is sending and receiving these bottles. I've seen people theorise that the receiver is Diluc. The reason being the mention of dandelion wine and a mark of an insignia hinting they are somebody from a prestigious household. It is stated that the receiver had stopped replying to the letters at some point though, so why would Diluc stop replying? I think this somewhat hurts the case. The other theory is that it is Diluc's deceased father, Master Crepus. The problem is he died when Diluc was 18, and he's supposed to be 22 now. That means he died 4 years prior to the game. The letter talk of restrictions from the Shogun that only started happening within the last year. This, in my opinion, discounts him as well. So who do I think the receiver was? I believe it is a character known as Varka, who is the Grand Master and Knight of Boreas of the Knights of Favonius in Mondstadt. But wait, Grand Master? That's Jean, right? Wrong. She's the acting Grand Master in Varka's absence. As Grand Master, it makes sense for him to have his own insignia, and his absence because it is stated that he departed on an expedition half a year ago, before the Traveller arrived in Mondstadt. Varka is extremely well travelled. He often leaves Jean to perform his duties in his absence, while he is gallivanting off on expeditions. At some point he may have been to Inazuma and met with the sender. This would also make sense as the sender wants to hear his stories, which is perfect for somebody who is well travelled. His Lightly is much older than other characters and more of a veteran. They are described as old friends, suggesting it may have been a while since they last spoke, and that they go a long way back. I've seen a lot of people jump to the conclusion that the sender is Ayaka. I personally don't believe this is the case though, as Ayaka is quite young, and I think the sender is somebody a bit older. As far as voice lines go, when it comes to Ayaka, she barely mentions the Shogun. I really get the impression she's wrapped up in the Kamisato house, arts and festivities, and is somewhat sheltered from what is really going on. But this is just speculation based on the information we have. She could well be concerned with the direction that Inazuma is going. So we can only take a stab at the dark who the sender is, but we may well meet this person ourselves at the restaurant mentioned here that I have no idea how to say, and I won't even attempt to. The restaurant doesn't exist in game at the moment, so I'd say it's safe to assume that it's in Inazuma. The bottled letter mentions war, Up until now we were given the impression of high tensions, but not outright war. This could be hyperbole, or it could actually suggest there is conflict in Inazuma right now. Considering we're in the early stages of Inazuma's isolationist policies, this could align with a conflict between the Christians and the Daimyo at the Shimabara Rebellion. This conflict wasn't widespread, just a specific location in the southwest of Japan. Inazuma could be seeing a similar situation, and the war isn't as widespread but contained to a small location, probably where the sender is located. This could explain why we're not hearing about war in Inazuma from multiple sources, but just hearing about type restrictions instead. Ayaka's voice lines give the impression she is isolated from this conflict. She talks about passing her time through arts. You may be aware of Edo period art. As a result of the Sakoku policies in Japan, culture was emboldened. This had a huge positive effect on the country's wealth and culture through the very restricted trade with the Dutch. This gives me the impression this is not a war-torn country as many may suspect, but it is just a small pocket of conflict while there is still prosperity and peace for the most part. There appears to be a lot of assumptions from people on the outside when it comes to Inazuma. As Alrani suggests, I'm not sure if people without visions would be worse off. I think the information we receive from such NPCs must be taken with a pinch of salt, as it is hard for them to know exactly what the situation is due to the tight restrictions. Now if we take this parallel to its extreme, there is one big key to the Sakoku policy, and that is the Dutch. We know that Mondstadt and Liyue are currently cut off from Inazuma, so who could be taking the role of the Dutch? What faction has eyes and ears in every crevice of Teyvat? That is, the Fatui. So what information do we have to suggest that the Fatui still have access to Inazuma? First of all, Tartaglia has a letter that he sent home to his family. In it, it states, this letter should come with 2 kites from Liyue, a rattle drum, 2 porcelain dolls from Inazuma, and a crate full of various snacks, telling us that at some point he had been to Inazuma on his travels, most likely within the same trip that brought him to Liyue. Furthermore, he has purchased goods from there, which tells us they may well be in trade. Scaramouche introduces himself as the vagrant of Inazuma, a vagrant being somebody who travels from place to place, with no real home or regular work, essentially a wanderer. His familiarity with Inazuma suggests he may be taking the role of the antagonist during the act, and it further hints at the Fatui having access in and out of Inazuma. So could the Fatui be acting as eyes and ears feeding information to the Shogun in exchange for access and trade, similar to how the Dutch work with the Takagawa Shogunate? I'd say it seems likely, but there are other roles that the Fatui could fill. As the story goes, each Archon has submitted their gnosis to the Tsaritsa, so it makes sense that the Shogun follows suit. What we don't know is the nature of that submission. Will it be taken by force, or will it come willingly? If the parallel I am putting forward continues to act as a guide for the story of Inazuma, I believe the outcome will be somewhere in the middle, an unwilling submission as a result of shown force. The Takagawa Shogunate didn't fall to a major conflict. The Americans practically forced a treaty known as the Convention of Kanagawa through what is described as gunboat diplomacy. In classic American fashion, they arrived at Japan's shores and flexed their naval biceps, basically saying, "Yo bro, we're peaceful. If you don't agree, we'll smash your face in, okay?" Knowing the Shogunate was unmatched by this show of strength, they agreed to meet and a treaty was negotiated. Soon followed contracts with the English, Russians and French, which came to be known as the unequal treaties, as they benefited the opposing parties over Japan. This was ultimately the driving force that took them from a feudal shogunate into imperialism. There was some conflict between the pro-imperialists and the shogunate, but they were defeated decisively. So could we witness a very similar event and the fall of the Raiden shogunate, ultimately resulting in her giving over her gnosis, as she has no other choice? If this is the case, the role of the Fatui may well be akin to the Americans rather than the Dutch, but they could well take on both these roles. The Fatui are often quite manipulative and subversive in their approach, so they may well be acting allies with Inazuma while they are plotting to take over through a great show of force. To close off, I want to talk a bit about the Electro Archon herself. It is a common theory she will be a depiction of Raiden Mei from Honkai Impact. This theory is still unconfirmed, but I believe it is very plausible. The themes with the character Mei could be considered parallels to what we're seeing with Inazuma. She becomes the Herrscher of Thunder in an attempt to take away the burdens from her friends. By becoming a Herrscher, she obtains the power to crush their enemies before Kiana has a chance to use her own powers that will eventually kill her. But in an attempt to preserve Kiana's life, she has to isolate herself from everybody else, and she has a shift in demeanour. What is clear is the Raiden Shogun is not eternal, despite being called the God of Eternity, as there has been Electro Archons before her, and she has been the Archon for a shorter time than Venti. The eternity she wishes to sustain is an impossibility, like how the prevention of death for Mei is also impossible. I showed this earlier in the video but did not address it, for a reason. I believe this could hint towards the Shogun's true personality, not as a tyrant, but somebody who is extremely caring. This body is the noblest and most eminent of all in this world. The word noblest could pertain to a few things. In the context of the Shogun and the feudalistic system, they are one of, if not the highest hereditary rank in the system. But noblest is also a word that can be used to describe one's character, somebody with high moral standing, courage, generosity, and honour. The word eminent also means renown and highly respected. The second line, it should hold absolute control over this world. This does not suggest that she strives for such power, but is deserving of it. One who strives for power gains it through conquest, whereas isolationism tends to preserve and bolster the power you already have. You could make the argument she is simply building towards something before she attempts some kind of conquest, and that could be the motivation behind the Vision Hunt decree. But I do not think our Archon is somebody who strives for domination. The final line, it once promised his people a dream, the never-changing eternity. The Shogun has the interests of her people in mind, promising a never-changing eternity, one that does not result in death and destruction, a dream that avoids a cataclysm. This is what I believe the Shogun's motivation is. She knows something about this world, about Celestia and visions. So if this description is talking about the Shogun, why is she deserving of absolute control? Are her actions in the best interests of everyone? Everybody describes her as self-serving and selfish. The line between selfishness and selflessness is narrow. In the case of Mei, her actions on the surface are selfless, taking the place of her friends to protect them, but Kiana is happy to sacrifice her own life for others, and Mei is preventing her. Mei wishes not to see her friends die, so she has taken matters into her own hands, serving her own selfish desires. So it begs the question, is Baal really a tyrant, isolating Inazuma in order to sustain her eternal rule? Or is she doing what she truly believes is in the best interests of her people? Has she become something else in order to protect them, just like Mei became the Herrscher of Thunder? Could we argue that the motivations go beyond Inazuma to the rest of Teyvat? Mei isolates herself from Kiana and her friends. Baal isolates herself from the rest of Teyvat. Could the Vision Hunt decree be in the interests of everyone? Could her true motivations be to prevent cataclysm and break the cycle? To Teyvat she's selfish, but she believes this must be done, and this is why she's the noblest and most deserving to hold absolute power over this world.